On the 21st of February 2011, Tamils Against Genocide, a US-based legal advocacy group, and Swiss Council of Earlham Tamils, a democratically elected Tamil body in Europe, will be submitting a complaint to the International Criminal Court under Article 15. My name is Rajiv Sridharan. I am the lead legal analyst and also satellite image analyst for Tamils Against Genocide, or TAG. Joining me is Ladan Sundaralingam. He is a member of Luzern State Parliament in Switzerland. He also is a political advisor for the Swiss Council of Earlham Tamils, otherwise known as SCET. Also joining me is Dr. Sam Parry, a spokesperson and member of the Australian Tamil Congress War Crimes Inquiry Team. And we are all here to discuss how we prepared this submission and what we anticipate in the coming months. The reason that we decided to initiate fact-finding and evidence collection efforts to support this submission was a reaction to the general neglect that we've seen from the international community regarding counterterrorism combat zones after 9/11. The submission alleges that dual national Palita Kohana, who is an Australian and Sri Lankan national, participated directly or indirectly in the extrajudicial killing of 3 LTT members after they had surrendered by waving a white flag on the 18th of May 2009 in territories close to the safe zone. The LTT members had names Nadesan, Pulitevan, and Ramesh. It's important to note that Ramesh was the chief of the Tamil Earlham police and not the lead commander for the Batiklo region. The reason that we are submitting this request to the International Criminal Court have multiple grounds. For one, the Tamil diaspora is dissatisfied with the history of Tamil justice in Sri Lanka in general, and the LLRC, the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission in Sri Lanka. We believe that after at least 40,000 deaths, 30,000 disabled, and a generation of widows, orphans, that a retributive post-conflict justice mechanism is what is necessary, and just mere truth-finding will not suffice. The geostrategic environment in which we work in is quite complicated. After 9/11, the war on terror has also, in parallel, waged a war on the enforcement of customary norms of international humanitarian law. So things from killing civilians to, in this case, murdering combatants after they have surrendered by waving a white flag, in the contemporary context, do not violate international humanitarian law. So this is the main reason that we have chosen to engage the International Criminal Court directly. Our general policy is engagement without dependency, that we encourage the United Nations and the international human rights community in general to investigate into the crimes that were committed during the last leg of the war. But we believe in parallel that the scenario where the Tamil diaspora, the Tamils in Sri Lanka, are denied the justice which they deserve, that is a non-negotiable end result, that there will be Tamil justice in some point. The second point that is relevant is this filing is, on one level, the first attempt by the Sri Lankan Tamil community since independence to exercise the option of pursuing international justice. Prior to this attempt, the attempts to enforce violations of law against Tamil civilians, in many cases violated by the state, have been suppressed inside Sri Lanka or in South Asia in general. If you go to Tamil Nadu, there are over 200,000 Sri Lankan Tamil civilians living as refugees without a path to citizenship. In recent months, we have seen the Sri Lankan Navy attack the Tamil Nadu fishermen in southern India. So this general problem of how do you create a justice process is the main reason that we have not seen any meaningful effort to enforce Tamil justice at present.
Die heutige Situation stellt eine große Herausforderung für die tamilische Diaspora dar, weil die sri-lankanische Regierung weigert eine internationale Kriegsverbrechenuntersuchung. Und das stoßt die tamilische Diaspora noch in eine größere Verpflichtung rein, damit wir als zweite Generation der tamilischen Gemeinschaft hier aktiv werden. Was wir machen können, ist nicht auf die internationale Gerichtsbarkeit zu warten, sondern auf nationaler Ebene in den Ländern, wo die Tamilen leben, versuchen, einen juristischen Weg auf den Weg zu begleiten. Aus diesem Grund haben wir auch versucht, jetzt gegen Palaka'ni, weil er zwei Doppelbürger ist, Australien und sri-lankanischer Pass hat, gegen ihn im Internationalen Gerichtshof eine Klage einzureichen, damit der Ankläger dort Palaka'ni in Verantwortung ziehen kann. Und was die wichtigste dabei ist, dass die Tamilsprechende, vor allem die zweite Generation, auf nationaler Ebene versuchen, das Kriegsverbrechen, was gegen Tamilen in Sri Lanka passiert ist, zu beweisen und auf dem juristischen Weg die sri lankanische Regierung in Verantwortung zu ziehen.
This submission plays an important role with regards to upholding human rights in Australia. One of the main alleged perpetrators in this submission is Palaka'ni, who is a dual Sri Lankan Australian citizen. And something else that's quite interesting is that he also held a senior official post with the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So in some instances, you can look at this as not just as an Australian citizen who had potentially committed a war crime, but also a former senior official who worked with the Australian Defence and Trade Ministry who has potentially committed a war crime. Since Australia is a signatory to the Rome Statute, this submission, one of the questions this submission raises is really, will Australia assert its jurisdiction over this crime? It raises the question of whether what really is Australia's policy on war crimes committed by naturalised Australian citizens. And furthermore, there's also a grey area, or rather a serious question that's being raised where can things just be brushed under the carpet because war crimes have been committed by Sri Lankan citizens and Sri Lanka does not want to pursue bringing them to justice. But when crimes are committed by dual citizens, then does Australia also have a responsibility to ensure that perpetrators who are their own citizens are brought to justice?
Right, and to actually build on that point, if we look at the South Asia region and the ability to enforce violations of international criminal law from the International Criminal Court, which is in The Hague, down to Colombo, you have essentially a zone of impunity because there is no regional court. And Sri Lanka says it has not signed the Rome Statute. Therefore, it has some sort of positive right to commit these violations of international humanitarian law. And so with no regional court in South Asia, you have the International Criminal Court, and then you have the Sri Lankan National Court. And so if both are saying there's no jurisdiction, then it basically creates a zone of regional impunity in South Asia where international humanitarian law can be violated and there are no consequences. So that builds on the point that you made, Dr. Sam, with regards to Palita Kohana's dual nationality and how this actually, this war crime with regards to the 3 LTT members who were killed after waving a white flag. Now Australia is on some level possibly implicated in this war crime based on Kohana's nationality.
Yes, and this submission and the information in this submission that's been put forth to the International Criminal Court also opens the door for us in Australia as Australian citizens to prosecute Kohana in Australian courts. We have many Australian citizens, Tamil citizens, who have lost their loved ones and their relatives in the war due to war crimes perpetrated by the Sri Lankan government. We have eyewitnesses in Australia who have seen war crimes committed and who will be able to give evidence. So this submission, although it's taking place on an international level and the submission is being made in Europe, it really does open the door for us in Australia to put forth a submission in Australian courts, and in some ways it will also test if the Australian government is willing to pursue and investigate crimes of this nature against potential or alleged war criminals who are Australian citizens, because history has shown us that to some extent Australia has been quite reluctant to prosecute alleged war criminals, or rather investigate alleged war criminals who either reside in Australia or who are citizens of Australia since the end of World War. So it's quite it is in some ways it will test where Australia stands, but it also opens the door for some type of attaining some kind of closure for victims and their families of war crimes in Sri Lanka.
And 2 other features of our approach in the submission. One is that the historical methods used to suppress initiatives for Tamil justice in Sri Lanka is inapplicable to this method, because this is initiated by the global Tamil diaspora, which has always been the sleeping giant in this equation for Tamil justice. It's one thing to bomb the Venue region or murder journalists in Colombo, which has the consequences of deterring efforts to enforce basic Tamil civil liberties in Sri Lanka. However, if this movement is initiated from the diaspora, it's essentially immune to the tactics of the Sri Lankan government, which has been used in the past. And the second feature is, since, and I had touched on this earlier, that after 9/11, that we have seen basically the death of the liberal doctrine of humanitarian intervention. We saw this in multiple countries, even East Timor, Sierra Leone. You can go to post-conflict justice initiatives in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Cambodia, in Latin America in the 70s. The list goes on. But this pattern has ended after 9/11. And so now the prospect of Tamil justice on some level presumably is in the hands of the United Nations, international human rights groups, big powers. And if you look at similar violations in other nations, such as Congo, Burma, Ethiopia, the civilian populations there who have suffered the same sort of crimes basically are plagued by the same circumstance, that everyone is waiting for the international community to come and support the justice system. So on the other level, we are basically attempting to circumvent this trend and create a new model to enforce justice for violations after 9/11.
I think it's also quite important to mention that this ICC submission is one of the first of many submissions that are going to take place. It also is a symbol of the coordinated step being taken by the Tamil diaspora, and especially the younger generation, who are really stepping up, and rather than waiting for the international community to do something and give the Tamil people the much deserved justice,